Those great big computer thingies. Today it's time to take a bit of a trip down memory lane. I've been around computers for a very long time. The first computer program that I ever wrote was probably way back in, I'd say 1969, when I was 11 or 12 years old. I belonged to a computer club at my primary school, and each week we would submit a program, and there were these things called punch cards. And that's how you used to enter the data into a computer. You would punch out holes in the cards. Well, we didn't have the machine to do that, but what we would do is we would mark the places on the card where we wanted the punch card operator to actually punch the holes out. We would submit that and then wait a week for our results to return on these big sheets of paper. It was probably my first program. It was probably something really simple like adding together a series of numbers. And I may have progressed later to something as complicated as calculating a square root without using the square root function. This was all programmed in BASIC, and BASIC was the first computer language that I ever used. It's still around today and used quite regularly. And in fact, the basics of BASIC are still there, pretty much, although there have been a lot of added on features over the years. So that was my first introduction to computer programming. Well, why was I, as an 11 or 12-year-old, already interested in computers? I don't know how old any of my viewers are out there. Many of you might be too young to remember a time when we didn't have computers. Others among you might be surprised to learn that someone back in 1969 in primary school was already using a computer. In fact, of course, by 1969, computers have been around for quite a long time, at least a couple of decades for reasonably sophisticated computers. But they probably first entered the public awareness via science fiction programs. Star Trek had already been on the air in 1966, 67, 68, something like that, 3 seasons. So that had already introduced the public to computers. And of course, the big one was 2001: A Space Odyssey, where we met HAL 9000, a very sophisticated computer with obvious artificial intelligence. This was back in 1968, remember. So, as a young boy who was fascinated by science fiction and all sorts of futuristic things, it's perhaps not surprising that I was attracted to computing at a very early age. When I went to university, one of my first subjects that I actually studied at university level was computing. And in those days, the computer with which I had to work pretty much filled the entire ground floor of the building. But by this stage, I was punching my own cards. But you still had to submit the cards, wrapped up, or in the correct order, of course, and wrapped up with a rubber band and submit them to someone who would then, at some stage, run it through the computer. And then a couple of days later, you get your feed out and go through it and figure out where you went wrong, then correct the mistake and do it all again. And this printout would come on these massive sheets of paper, all linked together, like kind of toilet paper for giants. It didn't bother us a great deal that we had to wait several days and then correct the cards and submit them again and get the result all over again. Well, it bothered us a little, I suppose, but we didn't know any different and we had no choice anyway. So over the years, I've constantly gone along with computers. I think I got my first desktop computer in the 1980s. And in fact, I wrote my entire PhD thesis in a very primitive word processing program on an old Amstrad computer. And printed it out on that continuous paper, but this time on an A4 type of paper. And then in the early 90s, I managed to find my way onto the internet, which I discovered through my neighbour who had a Windows-based computer and started showing me what you could do with things called web pages and this whole World Wide Web thing. So, of course, I had to get a computer, didn't I? And ever since then, of course, computers have been a major part of my life. I honestly don't know what I would do without, well, these days, a laptop computer. I still prefer to use a laptop computer than, say, my phone for various things. But we all know that this little item here in my hand has far more processing power and far more memory than that massive computer in the dungeon at the University of Adelaide. It's hard to imagine where we would be without computers today. In fact, let's be honest, society would completely collapse without computers today. We're completely dependent on them. Is that a bad thing? Well, of course, it makes us vulnerable in various ways to different attacks, cyber attacks, obviously, on the increase these days, getting more sophisticated, but then so are defences against them getting more and more sophisticated. And there is here, of course, a war that will go on probably forever. So, yes, there are risks with computers, there are risks with being dependent on them, but would I ever turn the clock back? No, most certainly wouldn't. Thank goodness for computers. Otherwise, how would I be talking to you?